indeed going to be a very interesting seminar on immigrant spies, Soviet intelligence in mandatory Palestine and in Israel's early years. It's a great pleasure to welcome and introduce our two speakers today, Isabella Ginor and Gideon Remez, who are both research fellows at the Truman Institute of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Their book, Volksspect over Dimona, the Soviets' nuclear gamble in the Six-Day War, published by the Yale University Press in 2007, won the silver medal in the inaugural award of a new book prize from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. So once again, it's a great pleasure welcoming you, and as usual after the presentation we are going to have time for discussion, so please save your comments and questions for that. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank all of you who came here, notwithstanding the heat and the traffic havoc in the city, and we both of us hope that you will find our material of some interest. Secondly, I would like to apologize. First, apology is due to the fact that we will be reading our presentation, otherwise we will keep you all here till Kriyat Shema Shacharit Shabbat. And another apology is due to you, due to the fact that today is the first time we are ever trying to use visual presentation. And any troubles with it are on our account and our blame, but we just managed to overcome the psychological barrier of it. And, we hope that it will make the presentation much more interesting to you. And the last but not the least, we are very grateful to Dr. Gerson for the invitation to speak at this distinguished forum about the new direction that our research has taken. He considered the subject particularly relevant for the Jerusalem Center series on contemporary Jewish issues. For more than 10 years, we have been studying the Soviet military involvement in the Arab-Israeli conflict. So far, we have focused on the USSR's role in the Arab-Israeli wars from the 1950s through the 1970s, as in our book, Volksspect over Dimona, about the Six-Day War. And we just would like to mention that the hardcover is already out of print, and whoever is still interested, only some paperbacks are left over. We encountered in our, and we mentioned in our book, of course, the well-known series of Soviet spies that had been planted in Israel as immigrants to the extent that they were exposed and their cases released for publication, from Israel Beer through Marcus Klimber to Untitled Chapter. But our main contribution to the field was to introduce newly available post-Soviet sources, and these sources also added some major figures who got away in Israel. These sources also carried the story back in time, which helped to explain the ostensibly abrupt appearance of a major Soviet intelligence presence here. Cross-checking these accounts against one another, as well as Zionist, Israeli, and other records, has been fascinating but laborious and elusive detective work. What we can now present is a preliminary progress report and sample. Soviet interest in the Middle East, and Palestine in particular, was not a communist innovation. Tsarist and Russian Orthodox presumptions to a role in the Holy Land went back for centuries and extended right up to the 1917 revolution. The Anglo-French negotiations that led to the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 went on in constant consultation with their ally Russia. The agreed future carve-up of the Ottoman Empire included an internationalized ground zone in Palestine, in which Russia was to have a say. The revolution and Soviet Russia's separate peace process with Germany put an end to Allied recognition of its regional standing, but the Bolsheviks first revealed the agreement, never renounced the claim. The Civil War was not yet over, and Soviet power was but newly established, The conference was held in Baku to promote the revolution among Oriental peoples. A university was established to train colleagues, and an attempt was made to found a Soviet Socialist Republic in northern Iran. While there was as yet little popular support for revolutionary ideas in the Muslim Middle East, the Soviets had a pre-existing asset in the new Jewish community in Palestine, as well as its ideological base and manpower reservoir in Russia. Many of the leading figures, whether they joined the Aliyah or stayed behind, straddled the still blurry divide between the two movements, Polei Zion and other Zionist groups on the one hand, and socialist revolutionaries, or SRs, Mensheviks and Bolsheviks on the other. So, in the immediate post-revolutionary period, when official Soviet policy was spreading the revolution worldwide, the Comintern deployed East European Jewish activists to establish communist parties in Arab countries such as Egypt. The first, however, was founded in Palestine as early as 1990. The history of this movement has been extensively researched, based mainly on its own publications, and the files of the British authorities, which persecuted and deported the communists, often with the collaboration of the mainstreaming Shu. As a result, most of the published histories focus on the bewildering series of ideologically based unions and splits in a movement that rarely exceeded more than a few hundred activists. These two had a very high rate of turnover, except for a few emissaries sent here for the purpose. Committed communists would not have immigrated to Palestine as such. Most arrived as members of left-wing Zionist movements, such as the Shomer Tza'ir, and moved farther left when already here, causing schism in such groups as the Shomer and Guta Mudan. But those that crossed the divide into anti-Zionist communism had little ideological reasons to stay here. Their numbers were therefore constantly depleted by immigration, including return to the USSR, to join Jewish kolkhoz farms in the Crimea, or an alternative Jewish homeland in Azerbaijan. Only a handful of them then escaped Stalin's purges. The Palestinian Party was thus hardly a stable base for Soviet intelligence agents, the more so as the USSR emphasis shifted from exporting the revolution to promoting its own interest as a power. Some of the communist deportees from Palestine went on in Western Europe to be recruited as important agents of Soviet military intelligence or GPU and KZD. The most famous of these were Leopold Trepper and several of his colleagues in the Red Orchestra, the Soviet spy ring in Nazi-occupied Western Europe. But they had not been insinuated into Palestine as Soviet agents to begin with, and in accordance with Soviet operating procedures worldwide, intelligence operatives were strictly separated from party activists. So it is not surprising that with only one exception, the existing literature on the Palestine party history mentions none of the names that we found in recent Russian sources. As an exception that proves the rule, how little data has emerged about Soviet agents in Palestine, Israel, and how haphazardly it surfaced, take the case of Bohumir Shmeral, a founder of the Czech Communist Party. In the summer of 1999, the Comintern sent Shmeral to oversee the Palestinian Party. He was smuggled into the country and lodged clandestinely right here in the Greek colony. But he was quickly caught up in the violence that spread after Arabs attacked Jews at the Kotel on Tisha B'Av, and soon also threatened the communist leadership, which was assembled in Beit Zafafa. The Haganah commander in Jerusalem, under Itzhak Shishilevich, nice man, right? Better known as Ben Tzvi, is her second president, dispatched a truck to rescue these Jews, but they hesitated to accept protection from the Zionists. The issue was settled when Shmeral led the way and was first to jump into the truck. He was then smuggled out of Palestine. Now, the 1929 upheaval was a defining event in the annals of the Palestinian Party, which had till then championed a binational class struggle. It was now ordered by the Comintern to undergo Arabization, that is, to subordinate any parochial goals of its Jewish members to the objective of Arab national liberation. This, in effect, doomed any attempt to infiltrate Soviet agency into the Yishuv leadership through the party. Communist activists, including Jews, did engage in some small-scale sabotage and provocation activity, such as bombings, through the 1936-39 Arab Revolt and afterward. But Soviet anti-British strategy began to hedge its bets by planting agents within the Yishuv establishment who had to avoid any connection with the party. So Shmerel's mission was of some significance, and yet we would never have learned about it if Party Secretary Yosef Berger Barzilai had not been recalled to the USSR, served in various Comintern capacities, was purged, and was one of the few who survived 20 years in the Gulag. He then returned to Israel and published a bitter memoir, which is the only source for the Shmerel's episode. OGPU activities in parallel with those of the Comintern began even earlier. As the Shmerel in the party apparatus, the caliber of intelligence personnel that was assigned here confirmed the high priority that the Soviets ascribed to Palestine and the Middle East in general. As early as December 1923, the first illegal resident, that is undercover bureau chief as opposed to one holding an official diplomatic position, was sent here by the OGPU's international department, whose head, Meir Trelisa, was one of the numerous Jews in the organization's top echelon. The first resident is a fabled figure of the revolutionary pantheon, Yaakov Blumkin. Born as Simcha Yankel Ben-Hir Blumkin, who was a boyhood student of Mendele Motorsport in Odessa, later joined the Jewish self-defense force there under Zev Jabotinsky, then became a socialist revolutionary. After the revolution, he used the standing he had achieved by then as a Cheka operative to assassinate the German envoy in Moscow, but was pardoned and assigned to Iran, where he headed the abortive Soviet Republic. Here he teamed up with another key figure, Yakov Serebryansky, also a Serb veteran, born as Yakov Ben Yitzhak Bergman. After the Iranian adventure collapses, they are sent to Palestine to inaugurate the illegal residentura with Serebryansky as Blumkin's deputy. Blumkin arrives in the guise of a religious Jewish immigrant named Meir or Moshe Gurfinkel and sets up shop operating a laundry in Jaffa. There is no trace of Blumkin or Serebryansky under any known alias in the histories of the Palestinian Communist Party, if its members were aware of their identity at all. This also calls into question the version that after barely half a year, Blumkin was deported by the British, who would hardly have released such a prize cage had they identified him. The likelier version is that Blumkin was recalled to headquarters, from where he was dispatched again in 1928 to take charge of covert operations throughout the Middle East from a base in Istanbul, this time under cover of a Persian merchant, Yaqub Sultanov, later Yaqub Sultan Zadeh. He raises money for these operations by selling rare Jewish books from collections expropriated by the Bolsheviks, including the Ginsburg collection and Lubavitch's collection. Blumkin travels widely throughout the region, including Egypt, and as every tourist has to have a picture, me and the pyramids. He also reportedly returns in June 1929 to Palestine, where he had already dispatched 4 Moscow-trained agents. One of them, Lech Kibelman, is the exceptional case I mentioned earlier of an OGPU agent who also figures with his wife Nechama in the records of the Palestine Communist Party as a Comintern emissary after 1929 Arabization decree. Stiebelman managed to dissemble for a while as a disillusioned emigrant from the USSR, but was ultimately caught, jailed, and deported by the British. We haven't been able to establish the Stiebelman's ultimate fate. Blumkin himself meets a sticky end when it is discovered that he passed part of his book-selling proceeds to his old mentor Lev Trotsky, then in exile in Turkey. His final recall to Moscow came in August 1929, after the pivotal events in Jerusalem. No less a personage than Molotov demanded his opinion, quote, whether to place our bets on the Jews or Arabs in Palestine in case of a confrontation with the British. But Blumkin was arrested in October 1929 and executed in November 1929 before his 30th birthday. Serebransky took over as resident in Palestine upon Blumkin's recall in 1924. He was reinforced by his wife Polina, and apparently they successfully evaded the British. They stayed for a total of 2 years and possibly returned to Palestine in the early 1930s as part of Serebransky's travels under a fake U.S. passport as Andrew Borok to set up a far-flung network of diversion and sabotage groups. In Palestine too, he is credited with establishing a Soviet spy ring, aimed for the first time at penetrating the Zionist paramilitary organizations. As described by the NKVD General Pavel Sudoplatov, Agentura files were opened about the Zionist movement Beitar and Irgun Tzvai Leumi in order to break them up. It would be years before Moscow adopted their cause, and some of Serebransky's recruits surfaced in key roles. Meanwhile, throughout the 20s and 30s, there are testimonies of visits to Palestine by various emissaries and couriers from Moscow. One of them, Arnold Deutsch, was recruited in 1928 in Vienna for the Comintern, for which he carries out missions as a courier to Palestine and elsewhere. In the 30s, he was transferred to the NKVD, trained and posted to Britain, where he recruits the notorious Cambridge Five, to whom we will return shortly. In 1929, Trelicer sent Blumkin's replacement to Istanbul, Georgi Agabekov, with a brief that emphasized, quote, we are very interested in developments in Palestine. The clashes between Jews and Arabs must produce results that are favorable to us because the British government will have to take one side, and this will leave one side offended, which we will easily be able to exploit against British. Palestine is important as a strategic location. On board ship to his new post, Agabekov is surprised to meet one of my old friends, who told me that he was now working for the Comintern and was sent to Palestine, posing as a Zionist expelled from the USSR. A recent Russian history textbook explains how Jews who really opposed the Soviet anti-Zionist line were allowed to emigrate. Administrative internal exile under a judicial ruling could be replaced with indefinite expulsion from the USSR. Exit to Palestine was arranged through an organization called Aid for Political Prisoners, which was headed by Maxim Gorky's first wife, Ekaterina Pavlovna Pushkova. The British issued the visas on the strength of invitations from the Histadrut for young people with professions such as carpenters or metal workers. Ironically, at the height of this process, in 1927, the Histadrut newspaper Dabar was carrying on a polemic against Soviet anti-Zionism, while the Jewish labor movement was actually assisting the USSR to infiltrate its own ranks in Palestine. Every case was individually decided by a special OGPU tribunal. In other words, while Pushkova's motives were apparently humanitarian, the OGPU could use this channel to dispatch its own agents, either willing or coerced, a technique that recurs later. And here I pass the place over to Gideon.
Well, this channel was effectively ended when organized Zionist activity in the USSR was banned by 1928. But then a new reservoir of candidates for dispatch to Palestine opened up with the Nazi takeover in Germany. The subsequent aliyah from Germany and Austria included quite a few Jewish socialists and even communists, which provided the Soviets with a new opportunity to insert agents under real or false identities. A typical controversy has raged for years around the Russian-born Max Eitingon, who became a student, a follower, and then a financial sponsor of Sigmund Freud in Vienna. Then he financed the first psychoanalysis clinic in Berlin. In 1933, he came to Jerusalem, where he also funded both such a clinic, which later became the mental hospital in Tel Aviv, as well as the Palestine, now the Israel Psychoanalytic Society. The money came from the family's business, by now based in New York, which had a monopoly on exporting furs from the Soviet Union. But Eitingon also bankrolled a Russian émigré singer in Paris, Nadezhda Plevitskaya, who in 1937 was involved in the abduction to Moscow for the NKVD of white Russian General Yevgeny Miller, a celebrated case at the time. When Plevitskaya was arrested, the French police found a Bible which Max Eitingon had sent her from Jerusalem, allegedly as an encryption tool. She was operated by another Eitingon, Nahum, who was Max's cousin, or by some accounts even his brother. Nahum Eitingon, after taking his turn as illegal resident in Turkey in 1929, which put him in charge of Palestine too, became Serebryansky's legendary deputy in charge of global covert operations and organized, among other exploits, the assassination of Trotsky in Mexico. On the way there, after the Plevitskaya affair, he had trouble obtaining U.S. visa and finally got one in the guise of a Syrian Jewish trader that was in need of mental treatment on the strength of a psychiatrist's opinion. Now, all this is highly suspect, especially since that year Max Eitingon had to take a long vacation for health reasons. But was he anything from a money conduit to a courier, or as much as an actual operator for the Soviets? And if so, was Palestine merely a convenient base for his operations elsewhere, or was he tasked with a specific mission here too? And was Dr. Eitingon, who by all accounts was a committed Zionist, just blackmailed into serving Soviet intelligence? These questions are still open. In any case, General Sudoplatov relates that after World War II, his agency set about reactivating the agents that Serebryansky had planted before the war, specifically in the Stern organization, that is Lechner. But this claim also reminded us of several of the many versions about Israel Ber's biography, none of which has ever been conclusively documented. Ber's own story, that gained him a senior post in the Haganah when he arrived here in 1938, that as an Austrian communist he had served as a ranking officer in the International Brigade during the Spanish Civil War, and was then converted to Zionism simply by reading a biography of Herzl. That story has been thoroughly discredited, but there is still debate whether he was actually recruited by the Soviets only here in the 1950s or much earlier. There had been several reported sightings of Ber as an NKVD trainee in Moscow as early as 1934, and later in Spain as a Chekist rather than a combatant. And if so, he was another Soviet plant in the Yeke Aliyah. In any case, 2 years after Ber, another immigrant with supposed military background arrives and is soon appointed as Haganah Chief of Staff, Moshe Sneh, General Zionist leader in Poland, who actually had only minimal military training as a medical officer. He is one of several figures who make it to Palestine in mysterious ways from what became another Soviet recruitment center, Lithuania, and especially Vilnius, where many desperate Polish Jewish refugees congregated as in 1939 to 1941, it was twice controlled by the Soviets before being taken over by the Nazis. We can clear from suspicion at least one future leader in Israel who passed through Vilna, Menachem Begin, based on his KGB file that we obtained there at Vilna in 1994. That's the mugshot on the cover page. Begin was tried, sentenced, and deported to the Soviet far north. But others, like Sneh, got out much more easily. Sneh, in fact, had already escaped once from Soviet captivity, which for most Polish officers like himself was fatal. It is all the more remarkable that he then managed to leave Vilna for Sweden. The Yiddish journalist Motke Tzanin, and for this information we're much obliged to Professor Dov Levin, Tzanin lists Sneh's younger brother, Yitzhak Kleinbaum, as one of several in Vilna to whom the Soviets offered an exit in return for future services. The younger Kleinbaum settled in Jerusalem, worked as a lawyer for the Jewish Agency and the Joint, and in 1945 he goes to Tehran to assess immigration prospects for European Jewish refugees via Iran. The following year he is instructed to reach Paris with his findings. He reports that a route has unexpectedly opened for him through Moscow and arrives from there in France in September 1946, joining his brother, who had escaped the Shabbat Shchorah, the Black Shabbat in Palestine, in June. Kleinbaum brings with him for Sneh and Ben-Gurion, who was also stranded in Paris, a detailed questionnaire from a high Soviet official whom he identifies only as A. This was for the Zionist leadership the first harbinger of Stalin's policy shift on Palestine, though we now know that internal Soviet policy papers had begun to consider such a change at least as early as April 46. The overt about-face came only the following year, which brought about Soviet support for the partition plan, approval of vital arms supplies for the Haganah from the newly communist-controlled Czechoslovakia, and the de jure recognition of Israel. This open pro-Zionist swing was so abrupt as to surprise not only the Zionist leadership, but even the Communist Party here in Palestine, another indication how far the party had been marginalized in favor of direct Soviet power projection, just as the Comintern had been disbanded during the war. But back now to Paris in the autumn of 1946. In short order, Sneh resigns his Haganah post and veers sharply to the left. His sudden conversion has been attributed to discussions with another exile at the same Paris hotel, Ho Chi Minh. But the Kleinbaum's questionnaire, or message that he brought with it from Moscow, seems far more plausible as a turning point, especially since he never returns, the younger Kleinbaum, never returns to his Jerusalem job, but accepts one from the Joint in New York, and there he dies pretty young. Kleinbaum himself maintained in a rare conversation that entered an Israeli diplomat's journal that his brother himself had told him as much, that is, that the message he had received through his brother from Moscow was the turning point. So was this message from Moscow a signal to Sneh to implement pre-existing instructions? The claim of pre-war Soviet penetrations of what we now consider the right-wing undergrounds in Palestine seems pretty far-fetched until one realizes that by 1946-47, all three members of the Lehi leadership had adopted an overt pro-Soviet line. Natan Yelin-Mor is the most obvious suspect of Soviet recruitment. He too passed through the Vilna conflict and was actually allowed to proceed to Palestine through Russia. He afterwards continued into left-wing fringe politics in Israel, but in the late 1940s, his pro-Soviet orientation was shared by his two colleagues in the Lehi leadership, who later became ultra-right icons. Yitzhak Yazernitsky, yes, this is Yitzhak Shamir in 1949, and the group's ideologue, Yitzhak Shaib, Israel Shaib, yet another arrival from Vilna, who later took the name Eldad, and who foresaw the Soviets setting up a government in Palestine headed by Shmuel Mikunis, the Communist Party secretary. I couldn't resist this caricature from Davao, and Yelin Mo in coalition. In his memoirs, Yelin Mo describes the posting of several Lehi representatives in Eastern Europe who linked with sympathetic Soviet officials and exchanged messages with the Moscow leadership. But these are all after World War II, and none are inside the Soviet Union. We're now trying to track down the possible missing link. One Chaim Bressler, a locksmith in Beersheba in the 1970s and 1980s, who told an interviewer that he had been Lehi's man in Moscow during the war. To prove it, he showed photos with top Soviet brass, including Serebryansky, who has been the star in our story, and also the future Marshal Dmitry Ustinov, who was then People's Commissar of Armaments. So we're trying to get our hands on those photos, but it's turning out to be a pretty tough job. However, there were other opportunities for Serebryansky to plant agents in the pre-war Etzel, and they're connected with Abraham Stern himself, then still an Etzel member, who would later rebel and form Lehi when Etzel declared a truce with the British for the duration of World War II. Stern was the point man for an ambitious plan hatched by Jabotinsky to raise and train a Jewish army in Poland. They were talking about 40,000 men for an invasion of Palestine. This is 1937-38. Stern was well received in Warsaw, where he frequented a fashionable salon that is also recorded as attracting intelligentsia from the communist opposition. The Polish army assisted Etzel with training courses for its top officers and an enormous consignment of weapons, most of which unfortunately had not yet been shipped when the Nazis invaded Poland. Now, in 1946, Sudoplatov himself receives a directive to introduce agents of ours into Palestine via Romania. They were to establish an illegal agent network for combat and sabotage operations against the British. Specifically, they were, quote, to renew contact with an agent of ours in the Stern organization, into which Serebryansky in 1937 had infiltrated one of his men. Once again, the caliber of the operatives that Sudoplatov sends to Palestine is surprising for such an ostensible backwater, and all three of them were Jews. The most senior and brilliant among them, El Taubman, already had an impressive record under his alias Semyon Semyonov. Among other missions, under the cover of the Soviet trade mission in the United States, he had been the handler of the atomic spy ring that included the Rosenbergs, while also finding time to complete a graduate degree in MIT. Semyonov made it back safely to Moscow. He got away when they felt that he was being suspected, and was reposted to Paris, from where he was sent to Haifa, along with a younger colleague, Yuri Kolesnikov, who was born Yona Ben Tuvia Goldstein. Kolesnikov had been in one of Serebryansky's behind-the-lines sabotage entails in Nazi-occupied Belarus. He won 2 nominations for Hero of the Soviet Union for these activities. And now he, quote, organizes the transport from Romania to Palestine of firearms and anti-tank grenades that were captured from the Germans. Kolesnikov and Semyonov set up 2 agent networks, so Sudoplatov reports, but he stresses that they did not take part personally in these diversias against the British, and Haifa was indeed the scene of several spectacular attacks by Lehi in late 1946 and early 1947. Semyonov apparently stayed here only briefly, as by the time of Stalin's purges in the early 50s, he was back in Moscow and extraordinarily survived Stalin's final anti-Semitic outburst. Kolesnikov resurfaces only in 1979 as what is called an obscure novelist, with the publication of a viciously anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli novel. It describes the aliyah and disillusionment of a young Jew with such a similar story to Kolesnikov's own history that the protagonist's name, Chaim Volditel, has actually been taken for Kolesnikov's own alias in 1946. The book got rave reviews in the Soviet press, and when a new Soviet public anti-Zionist committee was set up in 1983, Kolesnikov became its deputy chairman and apparently the de facto manager of its propaganda activity, which was formally ended only in 1994. And this did not prevent President Boris Yeltsin, after the fall of the USSR, from finally decorating Kolesnikov, as recommended back in the 1940s, as Hero of Russia. Kolesnikov's book reflects intimate knowledge of Israeli life and Hebrew terminology. Recent Russian accounts mention that he, quote, legalized himself in Israel and remained on operative duty here into the 1960s. KGB captain Anatoly Maximov, who was in charge here in the early 1960s, mentioned recently that in Israel our operator was a war hero, a hero of the Soviet Union. It seems then that Kolesnikov may have operated here, perhaps intermittently, for more than a decade, thus providing the link between pre-state and post-state Soviet intelligence in Israel through the successive turnarounds in Moscow's policy. He is still living in Moscow, and we'd love to ask him a few questions, but he has declined all interview requests, including our own. Like Kolesnikov, Sudoplatov's third man in 1946 was another former partisan, Yosef Garbuz, who remained in Romania to vet candidates for future transfer to Israel via illegal immigration. Simultaneously, a similar program was being pursued by the Kominform, the short-lived roof committee of Soviet intelligence agencies. Quote, in late 1947, it is ordered by Stalin to increase recruitment of Soviet Jews among those who then received exit permits for Palestine. Although the following year, the USSR at last gained a legal platform for espionage in the Soviet legation in Tel Aviv, the first legal Soviet resident there admitted later that his own dislike for Jews limited his effectivity in Israel. So he was rather envious of his Jewish colleagues who came here as immigrants. Another intelligence platform, which we won't have time to discuss today, was created when, during its brief honeymoon with Moscow, Israel turned over all Russian church property under its control to the Moscow-based Red Patriarchate. Overall, even if the recent Russian accounts of Soviet agents infiltrating the Zionist undergrounds are verified, can their instigation be credited with accelerating the British abandonment of Palestine? That is, a major achievement for Soviet policy. Or were certain Zionist factions, from Lehi to the strong Hashomer Atzair component of the Palmach, just useful idiots, to use Lenin's phrase, who served Soviet interests at their own initiative without being directly assigned and controlled by Moscow? To try and assess whether and to what extent Lehi operations, for example, were ordered from Moscow, we examined a few cases where there seemed to be specific Soviet interest, perhaps even stronger than the Zionist interest. The most notorious instance, of course, was the last, the assassination of the US mediator, Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte, just a few blocks away from here on the Rhova Palmach, on the 17th of September 1948. Most analyses of the assassination rejected, for lack of any smoking gun, the hypothesis that Moscow ordered the assassination, an impression that the British tried very hard to propagate. For the time being, we can add a good deal of additional circumstantial evidence, but most importantly, the USSR appears to have had reason to eliminate Bernadotte beyond their perception, shared with the new Israeli government, that he was a British stooge for plans to regain Palestine. About 2 weeks after the assassination, Bernadotte's deputy and his successor, Ralph Bunch, sends back some of Bernadotte's personal effects from their headquarters in Rhodes in the US diplomatic pouch. In Rome, an attempt is made to rifle this shipment. The culprits are caught and turn out to be British agents, led by Anthony Blunt, one of the Cambridge Five, who had by then retired both from active service with the KGB and with MI5, but is still called back on occasion for exceptionally important jobs for both organizations. Why was this one so important? Bunch's shipment included documents entrusted to Bernadotte during the last days of World War II by SS intelligence chief Walter Schellenberg, whom Bernadotte had befriended and tried to help arrange a separate peace with the Western Allies in the final weeks of the war. When Bernadotte had to let the British take custody of Schellenberg, the lead interrogator was another of the Cambridge Five, Kim Philby, here commemorated on the Soviet stamp. Not to pull up short here, as this saga would take an entire lecture to even begin. That's here I'll have to pull up short, as this saga would take an entire lecture even to begin. But suffice it to say that in 1948, Schellenberg's trial was on at Nuremberg before a purely American tribunal, and the Soviets had a strong motive to prevent his exhibiting those papers or Bernadotte's testifying in his behalf. Remarkably, the entire Rome incident and the row it caused between Washington and London is, like the Shmeron episode that Isabella described, known only from one testimony. This was given by James Jesus Angleton, the CIA official who became the agency's main contact man with Israel, to a British author who was writing a book about Heinrich Himmler, who was, of course, Schellenberg's boss. We've submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for the relevant papers, but in our experience, the prospects of obtaining sensitive US and Israeli documents only slightly brighter than for obtaining Soviet ones. We do think that the broader context justifies a reassessment of the Soviet role in the Bernadotte affair. But the Lehi, after all, did have its own distinct animus against Bernadotte. That is not the case in another Lehi assassination on which we have made little more progress. It occurred 6 months before Bernadotte's assassination and also here in Jerusalem. This is the almost forgotten and therefore little researched incident in which Lehi abducted and shot 2 Polish expatriates. One of them was an employee of the British government, Witold Hulanitsky, who was taken from his home on Rehov Binyamin Mitudela and executed on charges of spying for British intelligence and the Arab Legion. Hulanitsky had served as Polish Consul General in Jerusalem before the war and had actually befriended Lehi founder Abraham Stern. It was he who provided Stern with the introductory letters to the authorities in Warsaw, which led to the training course in arms sales from Poland to the Etzel that we mentioned before. In his memoirs, Yelin Moore writes rather apologetically how he was shocked to learn of this ingratitude toward Hulanitsky, and he would have prevented it had not the siege of Jerusalem cut off communications with the Lehi operatives here. Yelin Moore hints darkly that someone falsely denounced Hulanitsky to Lehi's isolated Jerusalem branch. But we have 2 documents indicating that the contract for Hulanitsky's murder was out and was known to him and other Polish expatriates before Jerusalem even came under siege. One of these was provided to us by Hulanitsky's daughter, who witnessed the abduction as a 12-year-old and whom we located recently. It shows that in September or October 47, Hulanitsky already feared for his life as he was being accused, so he said, of working for British intelligence. This he denied vehemently, but he did confirm that he had entered into cooperation with the anti-communist American secret services, which would make him a target for, quote, militant Jewish organizations that had accepted the Soviets as their main ally, unquote. So we were hardly surprised when in a recent paper on French intelligence in Palestine in this period, Professor Meir Zamir cited a French report explicitly stating that Hulanitsky was eliminated by Lehi on behalf of the Soviets. And there were more cases of anti-Soviet East Europeans being targeted by Lehi as well as the other undergrounds. Again, it's a saga that will take a few lectures to go through. This may provide a distinct Soviet connection, so stay tuned as we try to dig deeper into this. In any event, Lehi turned out to be a dead end for the Soviets. The Bernadotte assassination, useful as it may have otherwise been for Moscow, finished Lehi off as an armed presence in Israel, and it failed miserably as a political party in the first Israeli election. Only Yelin Moore got into the Knesset for 1 term, thus he did get amnesty from his short jail sentence. Mapam, with its domination of the Palmach and its strong base in the kibbutz movement, looked like a better bet. Both Israel Ber and Moshe Sneh were by now positioned in this movement, though suspected by some of its veteran leaders, and they took advantage of its resentment over Ben-Gurion's disbanding of the Palmach and leaving Mapam out of the first cabinet. We have no time to enter the controversy that still continues about the alleged plan for military putsch that Ber confessed was hatched in the party's security department. Yaakov Herzog recorded a warning from British intelligence as early as April 48 that Sneh too was party to such a scheme. Other reports hold that Sneh dismissed the idea as childish since, like Eldad, he expected the Red Army to arrive and to put things right anyway, so no putsch really would be necessary. Material evidence remains, though, in the form of sleeping arms caches that were maintained clandestinely in Mapam kibbutzim, some of which were founded after 1948, so that those arms caches were not merely holdovers from pre-state times. Testimonies vary wildly as to the purpose, some of them speaking of preparation to take part in the Third World War that was then widely expected on the Soviet side. The trove of documents that was brought out of Russia by defecting KGB archivist Vasily Mitrokhin includes mention of Israel as one of the Western countries where arms caches were prepositioned by Soviet agents for precisely the same purpose. and discovery of at least one such cache in Switzerland verified his claim. As no other caches that might suit the description have been reported here in Israel, is this a reference to the kibbutz Slikim? We're still working on this, but if that is the case, the KGB certainly glorified its reports to please its bosses, because the caches that have so far been discovered were far from World War magnitude. In any event, the Prague trials, the doctor's plot, and political necessity in Israel soon led Mapam to expel Sneh from the party and the sympathizers from the kibbutzim. This is an election poster. I'll show it. Sneh being kicked out, wearing his new party badge. And in the kibbutzim, most of the arms caches were simply forgotten and rusted away. Mapam itself renounced Stalin only after his death, which his children's newspaper still mourned. Mapam Children's Magazine mourns the captain of the revolution. But as a political platform, it was gradually lost to the Soviets, even though Soviet informants such as Aaron Cohen were still exposed there. Sneh became a pariah by joining Maki, the latest incarnation of the Communist Party here, but continued to provide information to the Soviet embassy, later serving as a back channel for communicating with the Israeli leadership. We found that he played a central role in the run-up to the Six-Day War. Bear went the other way, joined Mapai, worked himself up in the defense establishment as a protege of Shimon Peres, and reported prolifically to Moscow until his arrest in 1960. Their paths exemplify the USSR's abandonment of its earliest attempt to take over Israel politically from within, and its growing emphasis on espionage that would help to defeat a Western-oriented Israel from the outside by means of the progressive Arab regimes to which the Soviet had finally shifted their support by 1955. The Sinai-Suez campaign cemented this pattern for the rest of the Cold War, and, well, you can read on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions, comments? More than the American double and Yusuf
Gideon, let me just verify. You're saying that Moshe Sneh and Nathaniel Limor were Soviet agents?
Well,
is that final? Because Israel said
It's not
the
final.
opposite.
Well,
No,
yeah,
nothing is
now
final.
that you mentioned Issa Harel's book, Issa Harel, the former Mossad and the Shin Bet chief, published a book in 1987, I believe. Soviet espionage in Israel, in Eretz Israel, because he has a chapter there also there, by the way, which is copied almost verbatim from Daniel Barzilai. And he includes there several chapters on how I exposed Professor Sitte, who's known as the Israeli Klaus Fuchs, and how I exposed Aaron Cohen, and how I exposed Israel Bear, and so on and so forth. And then come two very bizarre chapters in which Harel takes trouble to exonerate Moshe Sneh and Nathaniel Limor, even though, at least in the case of Sneh, which we researched already much more thoroughly, the previous chapters actually point exactly in the other direction. And interestingly, in 1975, Michael Bar-Zohar published a biography of Harel, which includes, again, almost verbatim the other chapters, but none of this. So we asked Bar-Zohar, how do you account for this? He said, well, very simply, censorship wouldn't allow Harel to publish his own memoirs, so we did it in the form of interviews. And he read to me from prepared notes. And he was still speaking of Sneh very negatively. And this chapter that exonerates Sneh wasn't there yet. So we have a theory, which you can read about in our book. Now, what led Harel suddenly to show in 1987, 1 year after the Lamuno case, that his dealings with Sneh were all overboard and above board, sorry, and that Sneh was not a Soviet agent. Sneh was obviously at least a Soviet informant, an agent of influence. Now you can ask, so why did he get this rehabilitation? There are streets named after him now in nearly every Israeli city. Definitely, as in many other cases, he did services from both sides. Of course, he had a deathbed reconversion to Zionism, and he apologized for ever having abandoned it. But that's a reason perhaps to forgive, but not to forget. Well, we have hypotheses, but not proof on this. What we do have, at least in the case of Sneh, is reports from the Soviet embassy in Tel Aviv, how he reported to them regularly, including the case in 1965 that we found played a really central role in the lead up to the Six-Day War. About Yelin Mo, we only have the preliminary circumstantial evidence. We can't point it yet, but again, if Harel took the trouble to say that he wasn't an agent, that already raises some question marks. Why? And again, the question that Lehi at this point, and you can read the Lehi leaflets, they're competing with the Communist Party for support of the Soviet Union. There's a one from early 1948, which is Tshuva Esther Vilenska. Why? I'm saying we could definitely ally ourselves with the Communist Party, although we have a different point of view. The Communists blindly follow Moscow's interests. We see a confluence of interests in Moscow in ousting the British. But we're still a lot closer to the Communists than we are, say, to Macron. If you want to Lehi leaflet says. So again, were they useful idiots or were they assigned agents? We can't say for sure yet. But it's beginning to look very much in that direction. And in the case of Sneh, the only question that remains is why Israel took such trouble to exonerate him when he clearly was, for quite a long time, serving Soviet interests, also in some cases assisting with Israeli interests. There are plenty of cases of double agents, which we didn't get into now because later in time, where both sides considered that they got the better of the deal. In this case, perhaps in Israel it was considered that Sneh gave us a better shake than he gave Moscow. The facts are very, very, very elusive. Even if you find the document rarely really proves what it states. And you have to really read sometimes not only between the lines, but between the pages to get to the bottom of it. There are things that we can suspect, there are fewer things that we can determine, and Sneh's role is definitely. His brother's role, for instance, is still doubtful, but really highly, highly suspect. No, and I do not want to involve the Feinstein in this at all. I have no reason, we have no reason whatsoever to suspect the Feinstein any connection with this, and we intentionally did not even involve him in this research. He was a very young man when all of this happened. We have no reason to suspect that he was aware of it, and so what he recalls or states really is irrelevant to our research, and I'm glad you asked because the answer to that is absolutely no. Feinstein is totally unrelated.
The Soviet Union, of course, has left us somewhere, but I think the KGB is still the KGB, whatever it may be called these days, I don't know. Have we any reason to think that there are things going on even today that somehow match or rooted in?
Well, I would say one thing, that first of all, the times have changed, and the interests have changed. If at the beginning, in 40s, 50s, the main target of the Soviet intelligence in Israel was mainly political and political influence, starting from 50s, the course or the target of the Soviet intelligence, then Russian intelligence in Israel, is going to be economical, technological, and developments and so on. What you would call now the economical spy. Because there are a lot of, don't say that one of the things, for example, that we discovered in our research was that during the wars, starting from 1967, but later on, the Israeli technology, military technology, was a high priority with the KGB staff for taking it from the battlefield and immediately delivering it to Moscow and so on. So it's this is one of the main made interests for the spying in Israel now. Of course, including there are some other questions to be spied, of course, but I would say that the economical and technological issues are of the highest priority.
You say times have changed, I would say tout ça change.
Well, okay.
Soviet policy in the Middle East, mutatis mutandis, remains oriented pretty much the same way. If you look now at growing military relationships, say between re-establishing a Soviet military, a Russian military presence in Syria, for instance. Okay, and we think that sometimes Western think tanks dismiss too much the Soviet role here, saying simply that they don't have the clout anymore to match, say, the Sixth Fleet. They don't. But they have enormous nuisance value. And we've seen this with Iran. And both of us didn't believe for a moment that the latest UN sanctions would prevent the Russians. In fact, in order to get the Russians on board, they have to be watered down so much that they're practically meaningless, and that they would prevent the Russians from keeping the S-300 system sailing to Iran as a constant threat. And indeed, the day after the sanctions resolution, there was some mention from us that they were going to freeze it. We looked at each other and we said, no way. And indeed, 2 days later, it was denied that there was nothing in the sanctions resolution that would prevent us from selling the S-300 whenever we see fit. So the nuisance value of Russian policy in the Middle East is still pretty great. And so long as they see one of their prime targets as sticking a finger into American eyes whenever they can, it probably will stay that way, with intelligence activity and the match.
This question is for Isabella. You said OGPU. I know that's called GPO.
GPU.
Okay, no, but I've never seen that O in front of it. I know it later on became NKVD. And I have another question, is that you mentioned somebody who went to one of the two Soviet-style republics that was established in northwest Iran after World War II. What was that name again?
There are two names. It's Blumkin, Yakov Blumkin, and Yakov Serebryansky. It's the Gideon Republic.
OGPU. Where did
it all come from?
Before GPU?
Oh. Sorry, I just can't recall it at the moment. I have to switch my head back to Russian, and if I don't remember it, I will tell you later on, okay?
Thank you.
I wanted to ask regarding Max Eitingon, who's one of the most prominent psychoanalysts. It was one of 5 closest pupils of Freud. And psychoanalysis was completely rejected by the Soviets. So I didn't quite follow what was the connection.
Well, the Eitingon family had a close business relationship with the Soviet Union, going back to Tsarist time, remaining a few Soviet times, and they made quite a fortune exporting furs, rare and valuable furs like sable, from the Soviet Union, the West, including quite a wealthy man. As we said, he financed Freud himself for a while, and
For about 3 years.
he actually bankrolled. He set up the clinic in Berlin and then here in Jerusalem and the society on his own capital. And apparently, some of this money was also used for Soviet intelligence purposes and in this case of Libya. And now we have also a very high-ranking Soviet intelligence officer, known I think, who's certainly a relative. How close we have varying versions. Some say he's Max's brother, some say Max's cousin, he's related. Who's in charge of operations here in Palestine, among other things, and carried out some of the most important Soviet operations. He uses a psychiatric opinion in order to get a U.S. visa. There are too many connections. And of course, there is a direct connection, which is documented, between Ginor and this Madame Levitskaya, who was a GPU agent. No question. Now, it's very likely. Here I'm going to speculate, in fact, into speculation. Many of the people whom the Soviets, and this goes on into the 90s, the Soviets tried to recruit people who are on their way to Palestine, using all kinds of threats and blandishments. Threats to their family remaining in the Soviet Union, threats to expose all kinds of unpleasant things about them, various kinds of threats. To extract services from them. This is what we believe happened with Snez's younger brother, Yitzhak. Unfortunately, the Joint Archive had to move from one place to another in Jerusalem this spring, so his documentation is there, but we haven't got to see it. So it could very well be that Max, I think, went to the extent that he carried out all kinds of missions for Nahum or for Soviet intelligence in general. And clearly, he was a conduit, at least for money, and perhaps this.
What secrets could he provide?
Money.
Money.
If not the money itself, at least as a money laundry. But also courier services. This is what apparently went on with Levitsky. If you read now existing Russian literature, you find it stated as a fact that Dr. Eitingon cooperated with the Soviet. So,
first of all, let us say that no one would be allowed to be a major exporter of Russian furs at that time without rendering some services back to the Soviet Russia.
Compared with Armand Hammer.
Yes, exactly. You have to give something in the return. And according to some other sources, there also have been a couple of companies which have been set for the trade with the Middle East. So it's impossible. It's impossible even to discover the exact extent of those operations because they were worldwide. They were intermingling with another agents and with another families. There was a family, Grigulevich, for example, which owned a network of pharmacies in South America, which also have been implicated in the plan to kill Trotsky and so on. It's interwoven so tightly that it's very difficult to know where one ends and the next begins.
Again, I'd like to emphasize. Imagine, for instance, that Eitingon had to leave Germany when the Nazis come to power in 1933. Okay, and even Austria by 1938, but he was ready in Palestine by then. It's threatened, that he'll be given away to the British if he doesn't cooperate. That would be a quite easy way to extract some degree of cooperation, and this has happened so many times. We're now investigating a case later on in the 1950s, when an Israeli engineer goes back to the Soviet Union to visit several times, like 4 times in 6 years, to visit his relatives. Shubov.
Yom Shubov.
And the Soviets try to pressure him into serving their intelligence, and there's quite a scandal. But this has happened so many times that the idea itself is not outlandish. Was this exactly the case? Again, as we said, what we presented here is just a preliminary progress report. We can't state with any certainty that he willingly cooperated with the Soviets or that he cooperated no, but at least in the Plevitskaya affair, it's clear that he served as some kind of conduit, channel. And it was quite convenient for them to have him in Palestine for the purpose, which was then under the operations in Palestine, under command of Nahum, I think, of Istanbul.
And one day we would like very much to see if there's anything in his archive here.
In the Psychoanalytic Society, which still has his archive. We'll get to it.
Yes, I went to that and then
Okay. I was interested, you didn't mention the Soviet jury movement. I was involved in the Soviet jury movement, and I wondered if that supplied replacements for some of the last generation of people that you've been talking about. The reason I raised that is that I was involved in the Soviet jury movement in Britain, and we were infiltrated by a supposed Czech spy who was sentenced to 10 years in Britain, whose object was to try and find out about Israel and Soviet juries. And there was a lot of that going on with KGB in Britain, etc., and I'm sure it was going on around the world. And you didn't also mention, I didn't know, the idea of, we don't know whether this guy, for example, was really Czech, or he wasn't Czech, or he was Russian, and all the other states around Russia, the Eastern European states, whether they were doing anything at the same time for Russia or for themselves.
Well, first of all, we have been given a limit of time to speak, and we left a lot of stuff to be exhibited already.
Okay.
Because we just left a bare board. Of course, there was a attempt on the Soviet authorities to turn in the new immigration. First of all, in '68. In '67, after the Soviet Union cuts its diplomatic relations with Israel, there's no immigration at all. And then in '68, Gromyko and Andropov, they applied to Politburo, they present them with a draft resolution to allow a limited immigration to Israel for operative purposes, because they are without any intelligence base, or are left without any intelligence base in Israel. What they have only is the church. And there is a lot of problems with the church operating here as intelligence, because sometimes when the Russian clergy travels back and forth, they are carrying an enormous amount of newspapers even, and it's already attracts attention from Shabak, and there are reports that the church is dealing not with the religious matters, but with gathering secular intelligence. They're sending, as a plugs, they're sending temporary visits by illegal agents, and
probably as immigrants also.
no, sometimes as tradesmen, like Sukharim, the traders and so on. And we know at least for one couple who visited Israel for a few times, starting from '67 until '70s, to find out what the current political climate is, and how the Israeli government is going to behave, how they're going to deal with the continuing war situation. And when the agents replied, contact with Moscow with a report that Israeli government will be ready to relinquish all the territories, but Jerusalem is not negotiable. The agents write in their diary. The center wasn't satisfied with our report. It doesn't suit the bosses. And then, of course, you have testimony by Kalugin. They were trying to enlist some agents, but as fast as they, most of them at least, as fast as they go to Israel, they went to Shabbat and disclosed that they were approached, and some of them, of course, stayed as an agent, some of them were arrested and tried. We know only about the cases that were tried and publicized.
All the ones that were actually operated as double agents. There's a celebrated case of Viktor Grajewski. Okay, the Polish you asked about, Eastern European. Here's a guy who was in 1956, I believe. Scores, supposedly at least, one of the greatest exploits of Israeli intelligence when he gets Khrushchev's speech and he brings it to the Israeli embassy in Warsaw, and this is passed to Israel, Israel passes it out to the CIA, and an enormous...
A beautiful friendship.
Okay. Now, it seems extremely strange that a secretary in a higher echelon of the Polish Communist Party, so simply because of her friendship or more for a young Jewish journalist, should give him a top secret. You know, it seems a lot more likely that either the Poles or the Russians had some interest in getting it out, and this was the way to do it. But in any case, once Grajewski arrives here, the Soviets tried, or so is the story, they tried to recruit him, and he goes to the Mossad, and he's operated as a double agent up to 1967 and even afterwards, feeding supposedly false information to the Soviets, misleading. Who got the better of this? But the fact is that the Soviets did give him some excellent information, which got him immediately very well placed inside Israeli intelligence once he arrived here, and then attempted to recruit him. Whether they actually succeeded or whether this was another great achievement for Israeli intelligence, this is still anyone's guess. But the fact is that this is what the Soviets did. Okay, they did attempt to recruit him. Maybe they succeeded in recruiting. So there definitely was a lot of this activity going on. Certainly when there were major waves of Aliyah, any number, many of them, as Isabella said, as soon as they arrived in Israel, they came clean, and others didn't. Depending on how much leverage, I suppose, the Soviets had over them, remaining relatively.
Some of them probably were ready to work for another side for money. Because I'm sure that Kalmanovich is one of the cases that is the money that they did the trick. The man who wants to become rich at any cost.
In other cases, ideology. Klingberg
Klingberg
was ideological, no question. Okay, so they had various.
First of all, a lot of thanks. I think this was a fascinating story for my questions. It was really great. I mean, this is some kind of insight which we usually don't get when we study communities. Two remarks. One on the side issue. Look, it's really not fair to compare that character to Arnold Hammer, whom I for a certain period knew very well. Hammer was a convinced communist. His father was, besides being an abortion doctor, a communist. He went to the Soviet Union out of his own conviction, not because he was recruited. I mean, these were kind of...
The only comparison here was that you did not carry on trade, monopolistic trade, with the Soviet Union without coming to terms with them on some issues as well. It could be out of conviction, it could be out of, coercion, but
he came there voluntarily, bought a pencil factory to Russia, then he took the art out because he had to get something valuable and so on. The second thing is, I just wonder, What had been censored from Israel's story? Israel in 87 was a lonely man. Israel was already a lonely man 10 years earlier. Man who had great power, and he was more or less out of the system. He was a man who didn't. Israel.
Well,
No, look, Israel. When he leaves the Secret Service, he becomes
a monomaniac, really.
No, he becomes
He wanted to get back. He wanted to get the Mossad back by any means.
he was a
And he
lonely.
stopped at nothing.
He was a lonely man. No, I mean, I remember that when Dr. Lehman, the president of Hungary, died, there was a funeral. And Issa stood there at the back, and as we knew each other, I went to stand next to him and talk to him, but there was nobody, and there are lots of people who must have known him in the system. There was nobody there who even talked to him. That was 10 years before he wrote the book. What can you find out what isn't in the book? No, I mean, this book.
First of all, there's a lot that isn't in Harel's book, but is in our book.
No, but look, can you find out what Harel submitted?
Submitted to who?
He cannot have published the book. It wasn't censored.
Well, as I said, it was held up for quite a while. It was held up for more than 10 years. Between Bar Zohar's, several chapters of Harel's book on Soviet espionage appear verbatim in Bar Zohar's book, and some don't. Some of the rest is copied from Barzilai's memoir, the Shmeral affair, for instance. Harel, we said, we found another source for the Shmeral affair. Then we see that it's simply copied out of Barzilai with no additional. Harel, for instance, okay, in the case of Bear, Harel argues that first I suspected that Bear had been recruited back in the 1930s, but then I figured out that he was recruited in Israel in the 1950s. But Harel has a clear motive for pointing it out, because as the Haganah intelligence officer and then the survivor said, this is a very convenient explanation for Harel why he didn't get wise to Bear until 1960.
And where there's more chance that Bear was recruited by Naum Eitingon, who is much more known worldwide as General Kotov in Spain.
In Spain, exactly, where Bear supposedly served. He was commander of the International Brigade. So, about Harel, in our book you can read, this couple Mukasey, who was sent to Israel as a stopgap by the KGB after 1967, when the intelligence infrastructure collapses here, when the embassy is closed. So they're sent here as a stopgap, and they record getting a lot of sources. Right? And one of them, the way they described him, as someone who had been very important to government, and then he was thrown out, and he was very bitter, and that fits Harel to a T. Of course, it also fits Shimon Peres. But how he was very useful to them, that he wasn't aware of what he was doing, but they managed to milk a lot of information out of him. And more now, as time goes by, and it's no longer the Moshe and Nisi Bennett, people are beginning to speak out, that Harel really went off the rails. Even his late deputy, in an interview shortly before his death, he was not rational. And he, again, the chapter about snare in his book looks to us like an apology. Like some kind of pre-planted defense against the discovery of what we discovered, that in 1965, December 1965, he meets with Snare in the full knowledge that Snare is going to report to the Soviet embassy and tells him, forget about what Israel is declaring publicly, Israel is developing a nuclear weapon.
And it's going to,
And it's going to produce it and acquire it.
it. And arm itself with it.
And Sneh, of course, a week later reports to the Soviet ambassador, and this starts a whole chain of events that, in our opinion, leads to the Six-Day War. Now, and he writes this 1 year after Vanunu was sentenced to 18 years for doing a lot less. And so
This is official Soviet document.
and
It's not a hearsay. It's not a.
so there are a lot of testimonies that Harel would stop at nothing to get back at the people that he felt had wronged him.
But at that time, Ariel was still very...
No. Harel
In '65, he was the advisor to Prime Minister, but he was kicked out of the
A few months later.
of '66,
um,
and that's all.
after that, he ran for the Knesset. He served 1 term in the Knesset, became a close friend with Sneh, who was also in the Knesset at that time. You know, he says, Sneh doesn't say this anywhere, but Harel does. B'kitzur, we can't, well, far be it from us to claim that Harel was the Soviet agent in Israel. But we do think that at some point his activity became rather useful to them. Yes.
Now, assassinated what is the Soviet Union gain from all this activity?
Well, in 1947, the Soviets' prime purpose was to get the British out of the Middle East and prevent the Americans from replacing them. That was their prime interest in this area. And so they made what for them was a momentous shift in policy to support Zionism. The Zionist leadership was taken completely by surprise, as we mentioned. The Communist Party here was taken by surprise. The Communist Party here opposed partition until Gromyko suddenly gets up in the UN and supports it. Now, what did they get?
You know what is behind Gromyko's?
What did they gain from the espionage?
No. No. They believe, apparently, and the late Professor Agursky had an interesting theory on this that he promised to document to us, but then he died, unfortunately. That Stalin was convinced that the socialist Yishuv was a prime candidate for Soviet satellite when Soviet spies in America reported to him that the State Department thought so, and they did. If you look like someone like Roy Henderson in the State Department, they were convinced that these Jewish communists in Palestine, like my grandfather, were going to become a Soviet satellite. The Soviets had planned for a naval base in Haifa. Now,
My grandfather was in the communist.
no, but he was considered that way. He was a socialist, and he was head of the Liga V for friendship with the Soviet Union during World War II. This made him, for the Americans, a red. Now, so I'm not saying that he was a Soviet agent, but I'm saying that for the Americans, he certainly was a candidate for satellite status, and he was chairman of the Badlin League. Okay, so Agursky's theory was that what Stalin thought that the Americans said that convinced him. But in any case, be that true or not, the fact is that the Soviets considered for a while, that they had every interest in arranging for partition and then a Jewish state. They recognized Israel. The Americans didn't do that for quite a long time. Truman may have recognized Israel first, but he did it de facto. Took the Soviets another day or two, but then they did it from the UN. They were the first to recognize Israel. Now wait. So what did they achieved? First of all, their purpose of getting the British out. And then they had a big disappointment, which started when Jews in Moscow mobbed Golda Meir, and suddenly Stalin realized he was going to have a big domestic problem on his hands. Okay, that was the beginning of it. And then when Ben Gurion didn't let Mapam into the first government, decided he was going to pursue a Western orientation, then the things cooled pretty fast. But for the time being, at least, the Soviets had a purpose of getting the British out. They saw that this is why they clearly were
Getting a springboard.
getting a springboard through Lechi, through the Palmach, through Opam, through to a certain extent through the
Middle
Communist
Eastern
Party.
oil.
The Communist Party, at this stage, joins the Motzta Amazmanid, and Vilna, Mayor Vilna, is a signatory of the Declaration of Independence. You know, who'd imagine that the communists would do that? So,
I'm sorry, I don't think you
yeah, no.
You were talking about how they saw their vested interest in Palestine, which is clear.
And they achieved, and they achieved.
I'm asking a different question. With all this espionage activity, the other was political assessment. It had nothing to do with espionage.
Not only that. Look, let me take this word. When they sent the first resident here, Gideon, so one of his goals is to start the track of inserting Soviet agents up to India, because they are prepared the World Revolution. Then by 27, the World Revolution is changed for a confrontation with British and probable war between the Soviet Union and Great Britain. They need their people there. Their people, which are spread all around the world. They're trained in arms. They are trained as the heads of groups. They have groups of, if you have a war on your hands, and there is an uprising behind the enemy lines, it's causing demoralization.
It's a great military advantage.
A great military advantage. So they were prepared for different political or military objectives, but simultaneously.
First of all, the fact that some grand political or military scheme fails, which it did for the Soviets with Israel, ultimately, doesn't mean that they didn't try. But they did score certain successes, and one of the successes was the fact that Soviet arms won the War of Independence. Okay? The siege of Jerusalem was lifted by a shipment, thanks to a shipment of arms from Czechoslovakia that was approved personally by Stalin. The Americans had clamped an embargo. So the establishment of the State of Israel was, you might say, an achievement of Soviet policy to a very great degree. The Soviets were much more enthusiastic about it, very briefly, in that space of time, than the Americans. Not to mention Britain. And
the Soviets also initiated that Israel should become a member of the United Nations.
By 1949, all this had cooled off, but it was there for a while. So, now the fact that it backfired for the Soviets, it certainly did. Okay, and then they shifted their support from the Middle East to Egypt, Syria, and so on. And by 1955, this had been completely, 1954, completely changed. But for a while, they had a purpose. And you have to give this to them. They achieved it. Now, would the Yishuv here manage to establish the state, win the war, etc., without Soviet? That is a counterfactual history question that no one can answer. But the fact is that the Soviet assistance at the time was essential. There's no question.
Please join me in thanking our speakers for their